The PXG match famously introduced the ego types framework so that the fandom will spend the rest of its days classifying anything under the sun according to Blue Lock Myers-Briggs. Even though the concept has basically vanished into thin air after the NEL concluded. So that raises some questions to me. Why was the ego type classification introduced at this specific point in the story? Because let's be real, no matter how fun it is to write horoscopes for fictional teenagers, the core thematic message of Blue Lock is not that some people fall on one side of a made-up dichotomy and others on the other. Rather, I want to explain why ego types suddenly emerged during the PXG match in particular, and the function they play in Isagi's progression to become the world's best striker. Hello, my name is Sean, and I feel like I finally cleared my backlog of post-NEL videos with this one now. Also, if you like what I do and want to support the channel, do consider signing up to my Patreon. You'll get access to my weekly podcast where I discuss the new Blue Lock chapter every time it drops, and also help me cover channel-related expenses. To make sense of the ego types, we have to go all the way back to the early parts of the story, specifically to what we might call the genius problem. From its very first match, Blue Lock emphasizes that there exist players with extraordinary physical and technical abilities, ones that our protagonist could never replicate no matter how hard he tried. Time and again, Isagi faces off against characters with individual talents that eclipse anything out of his wildest dreams, from Baro to Nagi to Rin. And it's with Rin in particular that this issue is hammered home. It's not just that Rin has insane technical abilities, but also that Rin surpasses Isagi in the exact areas in which he has distinguished himself so far. The first part of the story presents Rin as a strictly better version of Isagi, to the point that Rin doesn't even acknowledge him as anything close to a rival. So here's the challenge that Blue Lock has set for itself. It has to present us with a convincing explanation as to how our hero could surpass each and every one of these figures without shattering its pre-existing world building. To trace how Blue Lock managed to do this, I need to start at the close of Blue Lock's first part. After Isagi exploits Rin's awakening to score the winning goal of the U20 match, Rin finally declares Isagi to be his rival. And with that, the new phase of the Blue Lock project perfectly coincides with the new phase in their relationship. This new phase also introduces us to a new flavor of Rin in Michael Kaiser. Kaiser is initially presented as a novel variation on the Isagi but better concept, following in the footsteps of Rin in the second selection. And significantly, Kaiser's crowning moment in the Barcha match is capped off with Isagi declaring him a genius. In other words, the start of the NEL reiterates and reinforces the worldview that the manga has perpetuated so far. There's a contrast between the chosen few with incomprehensible talents and the common rabble who can only scrape by through copying their betters. However, the genius of this scene, pun very much intended, is that it craftily hides away the fact that this is the first stage in deconstructing the very framework that it appears to be reaffirming. That brings us to the PXG match, which is from its onset pitched as Isagi's moment of reckoning with his greatest rival in the series. And if this is the match where Isagi is set to surpass Rin, it also demarcates the point where the story has to finally address the genius problem rather than merely skirt around it as it has done so far. After all, the concept of the genius is foundational to the story of Blue Lock, as I discussed earlier. Yet, if Isagi is to emerge victorious in the PXG match, the manga has to deconstruct our assumptions about the standing of geniuses in world-class football. This is where the ego-type framework comes in. It's, in my view, a really ingenious tool to gradually dismantle Isagi's, and by extension our own, pre-existing beliefs about geniuses. To sum it up very simply, throughout the PXG match, Isagi has a series of realizations about ego types that eventually culminate in the conclusion that geniuses aren't inherently better than a new category of talented learners. The build-up is absolutely crucial here. The manga takes its time to get us accustomed to and convinces of each and every step of an elaborate syllogism, so that we're basically forced to accept the conclusions about geniuses and talented learners at the very end. Let me walk you through each stage of the process. Firstly, Isagi comes to realize that different people reach their peak performance through different processes, some by focusing on their personal desires, other by adapting to the world around them. He also makes the key observation that one isn't better than the other, it's all just a matter of aligning your playstyle with your mentality. And immediately afterwards, Isagi leverages his newfound insights to draw out the full potential of his teammates and score the first goal for the German team. In other words, Isagi did more than just discover the dichotomy between self and world types. Rather, he devised the ego type classification and then fully leaned into his world type tendencies by analysing the ego types of his teammates to bring out his peak performance. That brings us to the second axis of the ego quadrant, the distinction between players who are at their best in a free environment and those who thrive under restrictions. So let's start with the most important question here. Why did the manga introduce this second dichotomy, and why did it choose to append this to the ego type framework? The most obvious function of the freedom restriction binary in the PXG match is to posit a core difference between Isagi and Kaiza. The NEL constantly plays up how similar Bastards 2 aces are to one another, but it also grounds their deep-rooted antipathy for each other in a fundamental difference in their inner psyche. Yet to me, this alone isn't an entirely satisfying answer as to why the manga had to explicitly connect this point of contrast between Isagi and Kaiza with the self-world dichotomy. After all, the manga has presented characters as polar opposite elsewhere without needing to anchor this in a psychological framework. And given the deep intentionality behind the self and world type introduction, I can't just imagine that Kaneshiro would bring in the second freedom restriction dichotomy for no good reason, that he just thought this would be cool or something. So here's my personal theory as to why the manga added a second dimension to the ego types classification. It's so that Kaiza could be aligned with both Isagi and Rin. He's a world type like Isagi and a restriction type like Rin. But why would that matter? Let's go back to the start of the NEL for this. As I noted earlier, Kaiza is introduced as another variant of the Isagi but better concept that Rin used to embody, and that's capped off with Isagi situating Kaiza in a long line of geniuses. There's also a marked parallel between the introductory scenes of Rin and Kaiza, where both of them shoot a ball out of the air. That's a parallel I discussed in greater detail in older video on ego types, by the way. And turning forward to the PXG match, the two are aligned again quite explicitly during Isagi's first goal, where he's hounded by both of his major rivals. Long story short, the manga seems to be deliberately creating some sense of parallel between the two, and with the knowledge we have up to this point, that makes a lot of sense. After all, they're both geniuses, right? The next phase of the match serves to bring the genius problem back front and center. As I noted earlier, the story had kinda waved the issue aside for a good while, especially after Naruhaya branded Isagi a genius of adaptability. Now, this is obviously speaking with a bit of benefit of hindsight, but it always felt kinda off for Isagi to be lumped in with the geniuses. The manga sorta brushed the matter to the side on a conceptual level, as if it was whispering in our ear, "Oh, just don't worry about that." It's therefore highly significant that Isagi starts repeating that exact moniker during and after Rin's awakening. The story is, as it were, testing the validity of Naruhaya's claim by investigating if Isagi's alleged genius can keep up with the other geniuses around him. And as becomes excruciatingly clear, Isagi is completely out of his depth when pit against true geniuses at the peak of their abilities. That brings us to the big revelation, the moment for which this entire framework has been erected. Isagi's realization that Kaiza is a talented learner like himself. I can't underscore how important this insight is to Blue Lock's deconstruction of the genius. It completely shatters Isagi's belief that all great players are geniuses, especially given that he had acknowledged Kaiza as a superstar by this point. That leads to another realization, that world types and talented learners are one and the same, and idem for self-types and geniuses. And because he previously surmised that one type of ego isn't inherently better than another, he's forced to conclude that this rings true for geniuses and talented learners as well. Their relationship is reciprocal rather than hierarchical. So, returning to my earlier question, what's the true relevance of adding the freedom restriction divide to the ego type framework? It's to show that there are real similarities between Kaisa and Rin. The arc hasn't been completely gaslighting us, but that these arise from something that is completely unrelated to their assumed status as geniuses. That's why it makes sense to incorporate both dichotomies into the same system. These resemblances are grounded in their basic psychology, but on the other axis of the ego quadrants. Anyways, let's turn to the aftermath, because the manga takes the implications of this radical redefinition of the genius very seriously. In my view, it's also really important that the resolution of the genius problem, with all the narrative weight it carries, was deftly woven into the very structure of the NEL. At least to me, it would leave a bad taste in my mouth if the manga simply explained the issue away through semantics. Fortunately though, that's not the case. Immediately after reframing the relationship between geniuses and non-geniuses, the story goes out of its way to show and not tell. To explain what I mean, I want to turn to the true embodiment of genius in Blue Lock, Seishirou Nagi. Throughout the NEL, we get this B-plot of Nagi losing his fire, culminating in his elimination from Blue Lock. So once again, let's unpack all of this. Why was it important to have Nagi fall off during this stage of the story, in marked juxtaposition to Isagi becoming Blue Lock's number 1? The entire Nagi debacle, of course, came about from him reuniting with Rail and scoring perhaps the most spectacular goal in the series. And significantly, this goal might be the greatest display of sheer genius so far. It's an almost inhuman achievement drawn on pure unadulterated talent. Yet, as will become apparent by the end of the arc, Nagi's elimination came about exactly because he experienced unprecedented success as a genius. Let me put it this way, if we were still operating under the old paradigm, that the most meaningful divide on the field is between those with exceptional talents and those without, it would be completely unfathomable for a player to fall off after their greatest display of genius to date. Similarly, Rail's plea to Egel after their loss against Barcha would actually be a strong argument in that model. Nagi had proven himself to be a genius, so if you believe that geniuses are by definition greater than the huddled masses, it would be the height of idiocy to let Nagi go. But that's the point. The PXG match has opened our eyes to the truth that the relationship between geniuses and talented learners is one of interdependence, not hierarchy. And more than that, we now understand that genius-style play is nothing more than a manifestation of the way self-types perceive value, not some embodiment of God-given talent. In fact, Ego responds to Rail by reiterating his views that talent is situational rather than innate. And so, the arc that redefines the value of the genius concludes with the greatest possible demonstration of this lesson, the elimination of Blue Lock's archetypical prodigy. And on the other side, we get the true winners of the NEL, Rin and Isagi, Blue Lock's greatest genius and talented learner, at shared first place. I know a lot of readers have mixed feelings about this conclusion, myself included when the chapter first came out. However, I do understand why this choice was necessary. There could be no better demonstration of this newfound understanding than showing that both types of players can become the world's best. That brings me to the bit where the video goes full circle. There's a further layer of significance to the two tying for first place. The ending of the NEL ushers in the third phase of Isagi's relationship with Rin, coinciding perfectly with the end of the second phase in the Blue Lock story. Just as how Rin finally acknowledging Isagi as his rival bookended phase 1. At the start of the NEL, Rin saw his rival as someone he had to pulverize. Where Isagi declared their long-awaited rematch to be a battle for number 1, Rin treated the existence of their rivalry as a temporary nuisance that needed to be squashed as soon as possible. As the final offers come in, however, Rin gets excited by the world recognizing them as equals, And that makes perfect sense, given that his rivalry with Isagi led him to understand his innermost desires and drove him to unprecedented heights over the course of the match. And Rin's new stance towards Isagi immediately becomes apparent when the Blue Lockers reconvene at the facility. Gone are the days of greeting Isagi with death threats. Instead, he's itching to compete with his fellow Victor on even the most trivial grounds. Fucking younger sibling energy, I swear. Once again, this makes perfect sense when looking at these scenes through the revised concept of the genius. Back when geniuses were still supposed to tower above the common folk, Isagi had defied the natural order by upstaging Rin. This was an irregularity that Rin must rectify imminently. However, by the end of the PX3 match, Rin too had recognized that he and Isagi facilitate each other's growth. And with that, the ego type framework had fulfilled its purpose. At least for now, since of course you never know what the future may bring. So, that's it from my end. If you liked the video, tell me the ego type of your favorite Ninja Turtle or something in the comments. But before I let you go, I want to thank my generous 10-euro donors on Patreon. Alex Mackay, Jesus Cujo, Liam Dunseith, McJ Cave, Melody and Orangey Legend. The world's a better place for all of your selfless egos. And until next time, Slangafal.